How are you, everyone? Welcome to our today's geography lesson. The topic is statistical methods. We will proceed with the study of the methods of collecting geographical data. In our last lesson, we learned the advantages of observation. Observation is one of the methods that a researcher can use to obtain geographical data. And in our last lesson, we gave advantages of observation. Learners, we saw that these methods provides first-hand data because the observer records what he or she sees or observes. Right? Observation, unlike the use of questionnaires where the researcher relies on information from other parties. In this method, the researcher uses his or her own eyes to collect data. We saw that this method provides reliable data. We also learned that it saves time since one does not have to look for data elsewhere, but records exactly what is observed. Those are some of the advantages that we learned in our last lesson. In our today's lesson, we want to study the disadvantages of observation. So learners, welcome to our today's lesson. We are studying the disadvantages of observation. Disadvantages of observation. What do you think are some of the disadvantages of observation as a method of collecting data? Number one, learners, is that this method is subjective. This method is subjective since it is based on personal observations. Since it is based on personal observations. It is based on personal observations. Learners, by subjective, we mean that the observer may be biased. He may be what? He may be or she may be biased and hence may not record observations correctly. He may leave out certain features of the phenomena under study. There are times we normally say we consider things that we want to consider. Okay? The researcher may be subjective because he's making personal observations. There may be an element of biasness when recording data. That is one disadvantage. Number two, the second disadvantage of observation is that the use of this method often requires a lot of traveling. And what does that mean? That means that this method may be expensive. This method usually requires a lot of traveling. Because remember we said that under observation, the observer has to get first-hand data. First-hand data means that the observer has to travel to the scene where he wants to gather data or information. He has to travel. He has or she has to travel. Because he has to take his eyes to the scene so that he can observe. So it may require a lot of traveling. If you are to compare this method with, say, questionnaire, all right, with a questionnaire you may just need to mail the questions, all right, and you can send 1,000 questionnaires, 2,000 questionnaires, 5,000 questionnaires to respondents, to different respondents. At the same time, learners, I'm saying you can send 10,000 questionnaires at the same time, for example, on email, learners. But the researcher cannot be at the same place, 10,000, cannot be at 10,000 places at the same time. So if a researcher has to collect data from, let me just say 50 locations in a day, that may not be possible to travel to 50 places in a day to gather information. But when using a method like questionnaires, that is possible. The researcher can send questionnaires to 50 places in a day. So you see, learners, the researcher may require to travel a lot, maybe 50 times. Each day he goes to one place, then tomorrow moves to another place, the other day moves to another place. That will require a lot of traveling. That is a disadvantage if you are to compare it with other methods. This usually requires a lot of traveling, and this may be expensive, which may be expensive. That is a disadvantage. Number 3. Another disadvantage is that it is difficult to use this method on days when the weather is bad. It is difficult to use this method when the weather is not good. Not good for the purposes of observation, learners. We are talking of when the weather is not good or when the weather is bad. We are calling it bad for the purposes of collection of data, such as on rainy days, such as on rainy days. Rainy days are not good days to collect data for an observer, okay, for a researcher who is using observation as a method of collecting data. It is difficult because learners, maybe he may need to have an umbrella when it's raining. You can see it can be very difficult to collect data when it's raining. So that's a disadvantage because he said he has to get first-hand data. That weather may affect, is affected by weather conditions. This method is affected by weather conditions. So the researcher may wait until the weather is conducive for observation of geographical phenomena. Learners, is that clear? Let me proceed to give the fourth disadvantage of observation. Learners, another disadvantage, that visual impairment may limit the effectiveness of this method. Visual impairment may limit the effectiveness of this method. Visual impairment may limit the effectiveness of this method. Visual impairment means not being able to see properly, and that may be as a result of failure in the power to see on the part of the researcher. When the researcher's eyes are not in a good condition to observe, that is an example of visual impairment that affects the effectiveness of this method, because the researcher is relying on his or her eyes to collect first-hand data, because the researcher has to record what he sees. But if he is not able to see clearly, if the researcher is not able to see clearly, then we say that researcher is being affected by what we are calling visual impairment. Okay, being unable to see clearly is what you are referring to as visual impairment, and the inability to see clearly may limit the effectiveness of observation method. So these are four disadvantages of observation as a method of collecting data. I can add another point, learners, that let me have another disadvantage, that it is not possible to collect data on past events. On past events. It's not possible to collect data on past events, or let me say, or activities. If an activity has taken place and the observer was not present, then that means that data cannot be collected, because the observer was not present to collect the data, because observation requires that the observer be present to witness the event or the activity. So, learners, these are 5 disadvantages of observation, and on that note, we'll come to an end of our today's lesson. The topic, statistical methods. The subtopic is methods of collecting data. Today we have considered the disadvantages of observation as one of the methods of collecting data. We had listed 7 methods. In our next lesson, we are going to study another method, which is taking measurements. But for now, I'm going to give you one revision question. One question: give 5 disadvantages of using observation to collect data. When answering that question, close your exercise books. Try and answer the question from your memory. Test your recall. Thank you, learners. Hope to see you in our next lesson, where we will study another way of collecting data known as taking measurements. Bye-bye.
Thank you for choosing to study with us. For more information, you can call us on 0724 173845.